So 8 or 9 days ago, Pastor Brad texted me and he said, hey, I have to do a memorial service that's in San Diego on Sunday. Could you fill in? So I'm usually ready to do that, happy to do that, but I said, give me a moment to think about it. Because I had two commitments. One commitment was that our son, who was working in New York for the last 2 weeks, he was being picked up at LAX during church time, and my wife, who just walked in, if she's shaking, that's why. She hates LAX, okay? She's been there, but she's never driven there. So I had to think that through, right? Do we get Uber, or what are we going to do? And she was willing to take one for the team. Second reason is because I, at that point, had just been out of ICU for a little over 2 weeks. I was in a critical care unit in St. Anthony Hospital in Frisco, Colorado. So let me tell you a little bit about the storm, because we're going to be talking about storms. So every 2 years, our family has decided to get together, right? Because we have one son that lives in Oak Park, Jesse. We have our middle son, who is president of a land development company, but he's in Orange County. He and his wife are go, 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 go. And so it's hard for them to have time away. And our oldest son is in Durham, North Carolina, where he holds our two granddaughters hostage. So we said, hey, we're busy. We know it's hard to get together. So biannually, we're going to get together. So 2 years ago, we rented a Vrbo house in San Diego. Had the greatest time. Just a long weekend. And, you know, we ate together. We laughed together. We reminisced. It was awesome. So for the last year and a half, Nancy and I have been anticipating this next get-together. We said, well, let's come a little bit east for our East Coast people. We'll meet in Breckenridge, Colorado. Breckenridge is a place where we made a lot of memories because we used to live in Fort Collins. And we said, we'll go back there and the boys will reminisce. And so we rented another Vrbo cabin. It's beautiful. We came in Thursday night, had all day Friday together. Well, Saturday morning, we said, let's rent e-bikes, okay? Because in the past, we've rented bikes, and we've gone from Breck to Frisco. It's a beautiful trail. It's through the woods. It's along a nice mountain stream. It was just a great event. So we took off. Little Ivy, my 8-year-old granddaughter, was behind me because I'm such a good e-biker, and we moved forward. Well, for some reason, we just left Breck. We weren't to Frisco yet. All of a sudden, I felt super, super dizzy. And in fact, it came on really fast. I yelled out to my son, Jesse. I said, Jesse, I'm dizzy. And that's the last thing I remember until I was on the ground and basically had passed out. If you've ever had syncope, it's really called syncope. I don't like to call it sin because we're going to talk about that today. But I got dizzy and I passed out. I wrecked. The good news is that my little granddaughter just had a little bit of road rash. But unfortunately, when the ambulance took me to the hospital and they did the x-ray, they found that I had 8 fractured ribs, 6 on the right, 2 on the left. They gave me a CT. I was okay. Did an echo, did EKG. But then they came back and they said, we need to do a little procedure because you have a pneumothorax. I had to look it up. Pneumothorax, and it punctured your lung, and now you have basically air leaking from your lung that's keeping your lung from inflating. So we need to put in the chest tube. So they put in the chest tube, and so here I am, not only in the worst pain I've ever had, and I swear, my wife denies it, I swear it's twice as bad as giving birth. But I was laid up there, and half of my pain was physical, half of it was emotional, because we had looked so forward to making new memories, laughter, eating, taking the bike trip down and back, and I just felt like I'd ruined it. I ruined it. And so as I lay there, I thought, this is a lot like life. I didn't plan on passing out, right? They ran the test. They found that it was probably just a matter of my age, because as we age, our lungs process oxygen not as productively. And the high altitude, it's 9,600 feet, which is why I'm wearing the cap, because as a souvenir, my wife said, I'm getting you a cap that gives the elevation of Breckenridge on it, so you can remember. And then just dehydration, not enough water. But yet, those unplanned storms, those things that take us sort of off our game, that interrupt life, we've all had them, right? For me, it was Breckenridge 2, 3, 4 weeks ago. For you, maybe it's been a divorce. Maybe it's a loss of a job. Maybe it's bankruptcy. Maybe it's a loss of a loved one. So I think all of us have been through storms by this stage, and we're also going to probably have future storms. So I thought it might be interesting for us to share and focus on a story in the Bible that outside of the crucifixion of Christ probably is the most dramatic storm story in the Bible, and it's about Job. Now, you should probably know that Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Job is older than Genesis, and we know that because the scholars who studied it said there's not much ceremonialism there. There's no reference of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Ten Commandments. It's an old story, so it's very stripped down organic in terms of understanding a person's faith with their Creator, right? And if you were to go to the grocery store and the Bible was in the grocery store, Job would be in the organic section, right? It's very natural. If you ever saw the World Cup finale last Sunday, the halftime program with 11 minutes, and Shakira was out there with her choreographer, dancers, and all the whole soundtrack, and then you got Justin Bieber who walks out with an acoustic guitar. Job is the Justin Bieber presentation, okay? It's very stripped down, very natural. So I think we can apply a lot of what we see in Job because you don't have to be a theologian to understand what took place there. So Job was a very wealthy man. He had a lot of money, he had a lot of prestige, he had a lot of power. And this weirdness of the story goes is that an accuser, now we think theologically it's probably Satan or the devil, but in the book of Job, it never says that Satan, never says the devil. It's an accuser. An accuser came to God and said, hey, you notice a lot of people don't believe in you. And God said, well, have you noticed Job? He's a righteous man. He says, well, yeah, he's righteous because you bless him. You give him all this money and all this success, and who wouldn't believe in you if you did that? And so they made this wager. They have this sort of celestial bet going on. And the accuser says, I'll bet if we took that success away, he would turn his back on you. God said, you know what? I'm betting on Job. He won't do that. I'll let you do that. And so through a matter of travesties, Job went through some terrible things. Job lost his children. He lost all of his herds and his cattle and his sheep, and he was decimated, right? Wiped out. He was broken. And then the first thing Job did is he got up, he tore his robe, and he shaved his head. And then he fell on the ground and he worshiped. I have to admit, when I was in ICU, I prayed, but it was, God help me, help my family. It wasn't just worship. But he was a righteous man because he understood what real faith was. And real faith is really just saying, God, it's all about you. It's not about me. Well, what was interesting is that the accuser came and told God, well, the reason why he's not turned his back on you now is because, well, it's because he still has his health, right? So God said, okay, I'll let you take his health away up until death. You cannot take his life, but you can make his health terrible. And so Job lost his health, covered with boils, chronic pain. And Job then not only felt the misery, but he understood what it was like to be alone. Because even his wife said, why are you still believing? Why do you have faith? Why don't you just curse God and die? The nice thing about Job, though, is he had some friends. He had 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They met to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, tore their robes, and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Those are good friends. When you can be with someone, you don't have to say anything, you can just be with someone and hang out with them for a long time. That says a lot about them. But I want you to notice what Job did. Job said, though God slay me, still I will hope in him. Again, he's not looking for a fix. He's not wondering why. He simply says, God, I want to serve you. So I want us just briefly to do an acrostic of the word storm, S-T-O-R-M, and it'll give us some practical examples, I think, based on this powerful story of how we can respond with faith when storms happen in our lives. The S stands for silence on the cause, silence on the cause. Job never found out why this happened, and it's interesting because he never pursued it. He never asked why. Faith doesn't ask what caused it, but rather, how am I going to respond to it? Whole different questions. God, how am I going to respond to this thing that's happened in my life that I can't control? How am I going to turn this into a win for the kingdom? Job he just had an incredible faith because, again, I would have said, why did you let this happen? There were moments when Nancy and I, because we have so much invested in our kids at this stage of our life, to say, how could you interrupt our biannual reunion with a stupid accident, right? And we're, I think, wise enough to know we didn't expect an answer. We knew that there are physiological issues here, but still sort of philosophically, we asked that question, why did this happen? The T stands for toxic counsel from friends. Now, in the verse I gave you, we know that Job's friends came in for 7 days and 7 nights. They didn't say anything. But then they started talking. And they started doing some things and saying some things that were not very helpful. So the point is, beware giving and receiving religious-sounding advice. It's often fake theology. Now, we've all heard in the news about fake news, right? And we're not here to discuss whether you're for fake news or against fake news or what you think of fake news. But in this story, there's a lot of fake theology. And the fake theology happened from Job's friends because they started giving him advice that sounded so spiritual, so godly. But it was full of toxicity. It was full of perceptions of God that were not true. And even though this is sort of a standalone message, it fits beautifully in Pastor Brad's series because he's been talking about that very thing, that we have some misperceptions of who God is, and we want to correct those things. We want to understand who God really is. So maybe some of you have been fixed by people, but none of us like to be fixed. So let's look at some of this unhelpful fixing that Job's friends tried to do for him. Eliphaz, in chapter 4, argues from observation. He says, hey, he's never seen an innocent person truly perish. So by the implication, Job's sufferings point to hidden guilt. Job, you probably did something you don't realize, and then that's the result of your punishment. Bildad, chapter 8, makes it matter of divine justice. Hey, he says, God doesn't pervert what's right. So, Job, if your children died, it must have been because of their sins, right? They had done something wrong. That's why they died. And then Zophar, he goes further, suggesting that Job is actually getting off lightly. Hey, you're lucky. God's forgetting some of the sin. Otherwise, you'd be dead too, right? So what happens in this situation is that all three converge on kind of the same thing. It's called retribution logic. That means suffering proves sin, and more faith would fix it. This must be deserved. And I think that we as Christians, sometimes well-intended, we dole out advice that really isn't proper. In fact, I love it because God, at the end of all of this wonderful discourse in chapter 42, he rebukes the friends. He says, my anger burns against you and your two friends because you've not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. And that's why we really need to understand that everything in Scripture needs to be taken in context, because any of us could look at the book of Job and read these chapters and say, oh yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's true. Just because it sounds true doesn't mean it is true. So let's talk a little bit about some ignorant things that well-meaning Christians say. Having been in the church all my life, having been a pastor for almost 25 years, and living life, I have heard some ridiculous things. Originally, I put stupid on the side. Stupid things Christians say, but stupid's kind of a derogatory, right? Ignorant is more neutral. Ignorant literally just means a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. So here are some things that maybe you and I have said, or certainly that probably you and I have heard. One is, for example, if someone dies close to us, you've heard someone say, God needed another angel. Well, first of all, that's not biblical because there's nothing in the Bible that suggests when we as humans die, we become angels, that angels are literally a different species than humans. So that idea that we get our wings and all the sort of nice sounding, words that try to encourage, that really isn't biblical anyway. We hear things like God wanted them home with him. So now God becomes the author of a person's death as opposed to a comforter. And throughout the scripture, certainly in Jesus' life, we see that God is always bringing comfort to us in our loss. And we hear things like everything happens for a reason. So we flatten another person's grief and we now make this some puzzle to be solved. Okay, figure out what it was. What was it, right? And it was very interesting that Job never did that. Even though his friends tried to do that, Job never did that. And the reason a lot of times I think that we try to do this sort of sympathy work and this fake theology work is because when people around us are in pain and hurting, their discomfort makes us uncomfortable. So even in our little platitudes that we give them, it's not to try to help them, it's to try to help us. I want you to feel better because your discomfort is making me uncomfortable. So there's even a lot of self-centeredness there. Let's look at some other toxic things that well-meaning Christians say. God won't give you more than you can handle. Heard of that? Well, it's kind of close, except that the context of that verse is 1 Corinthians 10:13. That's about temptation. Notice that even in the book of Job that God put guardrails on how much he allowed the accuser to tempt Job. But you see, a storm is not necessarily a temptation. A storm is going through a difficult time. And so using this verse to sort of encourage people really isn't biblical. Another thing is if you had more faith, you'd be healed. But remember, God just rebuked that in Job 42. He just said, hey, this is hogwash. My wife said, don't say the word BS. It's not in the outline, but basically God was saying that. He says, that is ridiculous. That is not true. That is not who I am. And then sometimes people say, well, there's sin in your life causing this. And again, that's the retribution theology. The idea that when bad things happen, it's because you did something bad. And so we should feel bad about it. But the interesting story of Job is that Job, he never goes down that road. He never goes down that lane. He never accuses God, and he knows that he, to the best of his life, has lived a life of faith. So that leads us to O of storm, openness to God's presence, not explanation. In Job 46, it says, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. I love that, because even in this verse, they're talking about the storm, right? Because God seemed silent for a while. It was almost like God was ghosting Job. You know, when you have people in your life who ghost you, they don't even respond to your texts or your texts or your emails. And sometimes we feel like God has ghosted us. And certainly that was probably the case for a while. And yet, Job still believed. He kept believing. But then God said, I'm not going to be silent any longer. God, dialogue is sufficient. In that latter part of the book of Job, God starts talking to all of them, and he starts talking to Job. And then Job is talking to God. It's just this wonderful dialogue. And I think that's what God is interested in. He's not interested in monologues, him preaching to us or us pleading to him, but he wants to have a relationship. And Job understood that, and so they fostered that. And the R stands for right response is worship, not rescue. Faith reduces the time between cursing circumstances to nursing a relationship with God. For Job, it was almost instantaneous. As soon as these terrible things happened in his life, it says he tore his clothes and he kneeled down and he worshiped. Almost immediate. For some of us, it takes a while, doesn't it? In fact, probably for many of us here, we still haven't done that. There are probably things in our past, storms we've gone through in our past, that we're still saying, God, why did you do this? Why did you allow this to happen? We haven't moved beyond that sort of grieving process. We're stuck. And what the scripture implies is that the more faith you have, the shorter the gap is between wondering why these circumstances happen to just saying, God, I want to love you. You see, worship is focusing on God's face, not his hands. Job said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked will I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. For Job, he realized that if I just try to get out of this pickle, if I just try to get out of this situation, I'm focusing on God's hand, what God can do for me. But true faith surpasses, it goes beyond his hand, and it looks at his face and says, God, you are wonderful. You are righteous. You are holy. And that's what Job did. So worship is looking at God's face, not his hand. And then the M stands for mystery remains, but God is still good. Mystery remains, but God is still good. You see, it's very interesting because even though we as readers of the story know the backstory, at the end of the day, Job never knew what was going on. He never knew about the celestial wager going on behind the scenes in the back room of heavens. But knowing why is a human attempt to control. Faith says, I surrender control. Even trying to figure out, why did you do this, God? Why did you let this happen? If you're all-powerful God and a loving God, why did this happen? That in and of itself is a plea to try to control the situation. Because if I had the answer, if I have the knowledge, then things will be better. Job says, you don't need that. You don't need that. You just need to let it go. Give up control. I love the mystery because we had a church similar. We came to this church because this church reminded us of two churches that we planted, one in Orange County, one in Scottsdale. And we had a lot of people who were new believers, non-believers, and some of the things they would say, just so refreshing. I know several times I had people come after church, and we'd stand and greet them, and they'd say, hey, that was a hell of a message. Damn good preaching. And I'd see that as a high five. I'd say, oh, that's awesome, that's awesome. Nancy was in a Bible study. She was teaching the women's Bible study about the books of the Bible. There was a lady there who was a brand new Christian, came to know Christ in our church, and she was Italian. And she was so stoked because there's an Italian in the Bible, Malachi. And she was talking about Malachi, but she just assumed it was a Malachi, right? So I know when we look through the Bible that we see Job, the book of Job. But I encourage you from here on out, when you look through the Bible, don't see Job, see Job. J-O-B. J-O-B etymologically has nothing to do with the name Job. But it's a great play on words because really Job showed the job of Christians. The job of a Christian, the job of a person using faith is to worship God in the storm. It's not to look for the hand of God, but look at the face of God. To trust him in his relationship with you, that he is a good God that loves you, and he has given us so much so that if I lose, I still thank God for all that I have gained. I have taught at the Naval Postgraduate School since 2010. I'm a civilian, but I've had hundreds of naval officers as students. And many of them have been on ships, large ships, giant ships. And one thing you notice about boats, small, large, medium, giant, is that they have anchors. An anchor is an interesting thing because an anchor is what you put down when you want the ship to stay still. And usually the chain is 5 to 7 times the length of the depth of the water, because they know that when the ship starts to move and drift, it will pull the anchor, and then the size, or not just the size, but the shape of the anchor. See how they create that shape? It digs down into the soil, the ground, the sea bottom, and it holds it still. So you see, an anchor doesn't calm the storm, it secures the ship during the storm. And that's what faith does.